Awesome. So let's get started. Welcome everyone joining us for this quarterly Orchestrator call, formerly known as quarterly transcoder call. After lots of discussion in the community over the last couple of months, there was consensus that we should rename the transcoder role to Orchestrator to reflect that function inside the network as a node operator, and that orchestrators do the work of transcoding. So hence the name change for this quarterly meeting. The topic for today is the proposed Confluence protocol upgrade. We had a call on this a few weeks ago, which was really context setting for layer 2 migration. And today we are going to be digging into the substance of the proposal. Yann Fu, Director of Protocol Engineering at the LivePure core team, is on the call, and Hunter Hillman, who's our new product manager on the core team, are on the call today to go over the latest draft LIP proposal and the timeline. Last Friday, I published a Medium article kind of going over the governance process for LivePure improvement proposals generally. So I hope everyone had a chance to review that, as well as the forum post from Yann yesterday that updated, that provided some updates on where we are. Just quickly to talk about the LivePure improvement proposal governance process. And as I mentioned, this was in my Medium article from last Friday. There's lots of documentation kind of going into the details of what this process is, but I thought a diagram like this was helpful just to kind of situate in context the process that ideas to improve the LivePure protocol go through, and that the Confluence protocol is currently proceeding through. And it starts with an idea and presenting that in public fora such as Discord, the forum, in theory, Reddit, Twitter. Ideas can emerge from anywhere and should be shepherded by a proposer and champion of that idea to kind of see it through to implementation and execution. And so the Confluence Layer 2 upgrade started in September with an idea that Yann posted in the forum, and we are currently in the draft stage of the LIP process for Confluence, and the community has been providing feedback via the forum, where the formal draft LIP has been living and iterating. And eventually, hopefully pretty soon, we will end the draft phase and enter into last call, which is when the final draft LIP is kind of put to the community as the name suggests, last call, last chance to provide feedback before going to a formal on-chain vote via the LivePure Explorer, with the core team executing the will of the community as expressed in that vote. So that's high level what the process is. Yann and Hunter are going to take us through the timeline right now and the proposed design.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can speak to the timeline a bit. And I know this is the first time that we've shared publicly any details about the timeline. And I do want to caveat this by saying that our first priorities, of course, are producing a product on the launch that are secure and that meet the needs of the community and accomplish the goals that are laid out in the LIP. And so, with regards to actual timeline, we're looking at the draft phase is concluding. Shani, can you jump back a slide?
Oh.
Thanks. So we're looking at the draft phase concluding around right before the holiday, the US holiday. And I think during that time, we're continuing to implement the designs that Yann has posted about in the forum, and we'll elaborate more on the specifics of those designs when I hand it over to Yann. And we're still collecting feedback from the community as we go along. After the Christmas holiday, we'll move into last call, at which point the designs and the implementation should be largely finalized, and we're really ironing out the last few details. That will proceed for 10 days, and again, there's a little bit of flexibility here, right? So as whenever we move into last call will proceed for 10 days prior to public testnet launch. And so you notice as the dates get farther out, there's slightly less certainty, but exactly when it will be. But this slide reflects our best understanding of where the process stands right now and how we expect it to proceed. Following last call, we'll launch a public testnet, goals of which are to as part of our security due diligence process, to ensure that the implementation reflects the design, and that both of those are safe from a security perspective. It's also to familiarize the orchestrator community and the delegated community with the actions that one will need to take when we migrate to L2, so that hopefully for at least some individuals, this is not the first. You're not just doing it live on mainnet for the first time. That the process is clear. Alongside the testnet, we'll be conducting an audit. We'll share more details on what that will look like soon. But it is a key dependency for the actual production launch. And so, the production launch is pending any security due diligence process conducted, and that's why there's a little bit more flexibility there. But again, our first priority is ensuring that this is a safe and effective launch and upgrade for all stakeholders. So I guess I can turn over to Yann now to talk a bit more about the architecture involved here.
Sure. So before I get going there, one thing I wanted to mention is that in this draft phase, well, first and foremost, thank you to everyone that has chimed in on the forum on various design iterations that we've been going through. And as most people can tell, some of that information around the design is definitely a little bit spread out across different posts because it's been going through different iterations. So it's just something that I wanted to clarify, is that the plan very much is to consolidate everything into a neater and more concise format as we approach the end of the draft phase. And hopefully that will be a helpful document that everyone can go through and have all the information there. So I think where we're at right now is that we have various iterations and ideas scattered around posts, and people have been commenting on them, which has been really helpful, but we definitely want to consolidate so that it's a little bit cleaner and more presentable. So that's definitely on the to-do list. So just wanted to clarify that before getting going. So regarding the kind of latest design itself, Shannon, maybe we can move into the next slide where I think we highlight some of the major points. Awesome, thank you. So the latest design that we've shared in the forum was actually, this iteration was very much informed by a round of feedback that we received, particularly from orchestrators. So thank you to Ultima Ratio, I think, Beerus and Numerous, and a couple other people that chimed in on the forum, highlighting some of the flaws and downsides and shortcomings of our previous iteration. So after we took that feedback, we tried to think about ways that we could address some of the shortcomings. And one of the main things that we wanted to accomplish with the latest design is to make sure that orchestrators, when they migrate to L2, that they are not disproportionately penalized if they have a lot of delegators. In the previous design, an orchestrator migrated with its own stake. And as a result, because it only migrates with its own stake, if the orchestrator proactively migrates to L2 and none of its delegators do anything, then the orchestrator essentially is on L2, but lost all its delegators or lost a bunch of delegated stake, which felt like it disproportionately penalized orchestrators that have worked hard to attract stake delegation previously on L1. So that was a big factor in our thinking. Another factor in our thinking was the cost of migration, especially for smaller delegators. So delegators that might only have a small amount of stake on L1 and have only earned a very small amount of fees on L1. The cost of migration just due to gas prices on L1 Ethereum could end up being pretty burdensome for those delegators. And we wanted to, our hope was that we could be in a situation where those small delegators could get to L2 as well, so that they could continue participating in the system. So those were two big areas that we wanted to consider in the latest design. And what we've landed on thus far is, I think, more or less summarized by some of these points here, where first, when orchestrators migrate to L2, now instead of migrating with just their own stake, they will migrate with their entire delegated stake. So if a bunch of delegators have delegated 100 LPT to an orchestrator, that stake is going to be migrated to L2 when the orchestrator decides to migrate. So as a result, even if a delegator is passive or inactive on L1, its stake will be proactively moved to L2 alongside the orchestrator when the orchestrator takes action. And the impact of this is that an orchestrator will no longer lose its delegators or lose its stake if it proactively moves to L2. And that's what we want them to do. We want them to proactively move. So that's one big change in this latest iteration. Another big change in this iteration is the actions that a delegator can take. So at the moment, we'll still support delegators proactively migrating their stake over as well. But the addition in this design is that now we've introduced this claiming process on L2, where the goal of this claiming process is for a delegator to not have to pay any transaction costs on L1 and only have to pay transaction costs on L2, which should be significantly cheaper than any transaction costs that they would pay on L1. And the way that this is accomplished is via a state snapshot process, where on L1, at the moment, we know how much stake each delegator has. And the challenge is how does L2, how do the contracts on L2 then determine how much stake a delegator should have? And the way that we're planning on doing this is, if anyone on the call is familiar with the previous LIP that was executed last year, I believe it was LIP 52, it follows a similar process where a snapshot is taken that snapshot tells us how much stake and how many fees each delegator has. And then that snapshot can be used in order to later on prove to a contract how much stake and fees a delegator has. So this was previously done for LIP 52 for gas efficiency reasons. So can provide a link to that if people are interested in the historical context. But the plan is to follow a similar approach here, where rather than having delegators necessarily submit a transaction on L1 in order to migrate over to L2, delegators can use a snapshot on L2 in order to directly claim their stake and fees on L2. So without submitting a transaction on L1, they're able to submit a transaction on L2 and claim any stake and fees that they had on L1. And this bypasses the L1 transaction requirement. However, one caveat and one important consideration here is that because this snapshot needs to be taken off-chain, so this is not something a contract can do on its own. It is not capable of doing this snapshot process on its own. What you have to do is off-chain, you have to create that snapshot and then post that snapshot on L2 so that it can be used for this claiming process. So I think a natural question here is, how do you trust that the snapshot is correct in the first place if it's generated off-chain and if the contract is not the one generating the snapshot? So this is something that was, we tried to tackle with LIP 52 as well. And the process that was taken is making sure that there is a reasonable amount of time for anyone in the community to review the data in the snapshot. And there's going to be an algorithmic process and a script that anyone can run and any process anyone can go through in order to verify that that snapshot is correct and it's not reporting incorrect stake and fees for any particular delegator. So that's the purpose of this delay period, where what would happen is that when the Confluence upgrade happens, a snapshot is created based on all the stake and fees of delegators on L1. And then there's going to be a delay period. At the moment, the thought is having it be roughly 7 days. And during that 7 days, a delegator cannot claim on L2 just quite yet, but anyone can review the contents of the snapshot off chain in order to make sure that it looks correct. And then finally, after that delay period, after that 7 days, that snapshot becomes available on layer 2. And then, and only then, delegators will be able to claim their stake and fees on L2 using that snapshot. So using the delay period to make sure that everything looks right. And then only after that delay period, delegators will be able to claim on L2. The last few details that I think are worth mentioning here are that in order to generate that snapshot in the first place, we need to make sure that we have a fixed amount of stake and fees for each delegator, because we wouldn't want to end up in a scenario where you create a snapshot of the stake and fees of delegators on layer 1, and then their stake and fees change. Then there's the question of, well, what should you do about that change? So in order to address this, as I mentioned in the forum post that I shared yesterday, the current plan is to actually freeze actions on layer 1 when the Confluence upgrade happens, so that the snapshot can be taken. And the practical implication of that is that that means protocol transactions, protocol inflation, and work distribution on layer 1 is going to stop at that point. And starting from that point, protocol transactions, work distribution, and protocol inflation is going to happen exclusively on layer 2. And at that point, orchestrators can already migrate to layer 2. So as soon as the orchestrator migrates to layer 2, they're ready to participate in the protocol, receive work, and also be eligible for protocol inflation. And for delegators, if they want to proactively move over, they can choose to do so. But the more cost-effective option for them will most likely be to wait through this delay period, wait through this 7 days, and then claim directly on layer 2 when they choose to do so. So I think the points here roughly summarize what I just mentioned, where there's going to be a freezing of protocol transactions on layer 1. There's going to be a snapshot and a public review process for that snapshot. Orchestrators, as soon as the upgrade happens, are able to submit a transaction on layer 1 in order to move all of their delegated stake to layer 2. All protocol inflation and fees are going to be happening on layer 2 post upgrade. And after the delay period, delegators will be able to more cost effectively claim their stake and fees on layer 2. So I think at a high level, that summarizes kind of the major points of this latest pass at the design. As I mentioned, there was a forum post yesterday that highlighted some of the details around protocol inflation and work distribution. And the plan is definitely to consolidate all of this into a more cohesive document soon. But I think I'll pause there just because I think that covers most of the new things about the design that we wanted to make sure that the community was aware of. Hunter or Shannon, do you think I missed anything there? Also happy to open it up from here on out.
I think that covered. I would love to hear if the community has any questions.
Great. I know Beerus, is Beerus on the call? I know he had planned to provide some comments. I know, also know.
Yeah,
Hey.
I'm here. Hi. Yeah, so I'm Beerus. I'm a long-term community member and orchestrator operator. So yeah, obviously I'm really looking forward to this update since the cost of staking and doing the daily reward transactions have really become prohibitive during the last few months, especially for small orchestrators and stakers. So I do think that if we want to have a truly open streaming network, it's clear that we need to improve this, right? So I'm glad that the Livepeer team recognizes the importance of low fees and is moving to the layer 2. And I also wanted to thank the team for openly communicating the migration plan and listening for the community feedback. So I'm really happy with the latest iteration, and I do think it's the right path forward. Also, I do like the clear cut for that only layer 2 receives inflation and work. I think it's easier from a user perspective to have a clear cut versus a hybrid approach. So yeah, I mean, no question from my side.
Awesome. I'm noticing some questions rolling in the chat as well. We can address those. So first off, Doug has asked, will the community have to vote and pass an LIP to accept the snapshot, or will there be some other process for accepting or rejecting it? So the plan right now, and Yann, feel free to cut in and if you have anything to add here. The plan right now is to conduct the governance actions in a single LIP that queues up the acceptance of the snapshot pending community consensus on that snapshot. So unless there is a consensus that the snapshot is not valid, the update will proceed in around 7 days, the round number that is specified. If there is a consensus that the snapshot should be rejected, the multi-sig will cancel the upgrade. Anything to add, Yann?
Yeah, just a little more context here is that within the contract system, in a previous LIP, we introduced this. Introduced the possibility of a delayed update. This was in LIP 25, which introduced a governor contract, and the governor contract is responsible for queuing up updates with an optional delay. And the idea behind the optional delay was in cases where you wanted to make sure that there is complete transparency around what's going into an update, giving people on chain. So that's something that you can see transparently on chain. The idea was that everyone can see that on chain and there's be a fixed period of time where that update could actually be executed. So a thought right now is that we could go through a process with 2 separate LIPs, one for Confluence and one for this snapshot. But thinking a little bit about what is the most convenient and accessible to the community, as suggested by Hunter, what we can do is, as a part of the Confluence LIP, queue the generated snapshot on chain so that everyone can see what that snapshot is going to look like. For actual technical details, the snapshot would consist of a Merkle root. So we would generate a Merkle tree of all the relevant state on L1, and then anyone could see the queued Merkle root on chain via the governor, but it wouldn't be usable for the entirety of the delay period, and only after the delay period would someone be able to execute that update such that it's usable for claiming on layer 2. So that was the technical way that we were thinking about going about this, and the interest there was to make things a little more accessible for the community. And as Hunter mentioned, if there is consensus that there is a problem with the snapshot, that update can be canceled before it's actually executed. Definitely can share more kind of deep details on this separately, but at a high level, that was the current thought process.
Yann, I'm noticing that Stryker has asked, is there some documentation on how the snapshot can be validated? Do you have any details there?
There's no documentation specific to this snapshot yet, but in terms of this is where the previous LIP that I mentioned, LIP 52, is actually useful because we built some tooling for that, and it's available in GitHub already, which I believe the name of the repository is called like Merkle Earnings CLI, where that was a tool that anyone could use for LIP 52 in order to validate the snapshot. And roughly speaking, what it did was that it queried the relevant state on the contracts and then reconstructed the snapshot on its own so that you could check that the end Merkle root for that snapshot matches up with the one that is proposed. So we're currently planning on reusing much of that. There's going to be a few small tweaks that need to be made. So while there isn't any documentation available yet specifically for this snapshot that we're talking about for Confluence, if people want to get a sense of what it's going to look like, I can link to that. And as I mentioned, there'll be some small tweaks, but the process will look roughly the same. And we'll definitely create documentation specific for this snapshot as soon as it's ready.
Noticing a few other questions in the chat as well. First, what is the biggest risk to the plan? Secondly, will LPT still be able to be moved back to L1 and also onto other L2s?
Yeah, so I think the biggest risk is, I'd say, technical risk, in that we want to make sure this is a pretty big migration, right? And as of the latest iteration of the design, we're choosing to have this be a kind of strict cutoff process. We're removing everything over because we think it's worthwhile. So with that, I think comes the technical risk, which is making sure that that entire process. So one, not only that entire process works as is expected, because we have some cross-chain logic that we're implementing in order to facilitate the migration. So that's one risk. And I think another risk is, of course, that while we've chosen Arbitrum as the target L2, and one of the reasons for that is, relatively speaking, it's gotten more battle testing in the recent months since it's gone live relative to other layer 2s. However, on absolute terms, it's still a very young and relatively immature platform, especially if you compare it to Ethereum. So of course, that is always going to be a technical risk as well. And I think it's just the case that from our point of view, the pros for the community outweigh the cons when it comes to this migration. However, that being said, in order to address some of these technical risks, we're of course doing a couple things as well. So for the first point around making sure the migration logic is implemented correctly, that's why we're going through the public testnet process. The core team is spending time on security review themselves. And that's why we're also going through that security audit process that Hunter mentioned earlier. So those are some of the things that we're looking to do to mitigate that risk. And on the latter, regarding the relative immaturity and of Arbitrum and it still being relatively young, some of the things that we're doing there is just making sure that we have a plan of what the community can do in the scenario that there are problems there. So we don't expect this to be the case. But part of the design right now is that when we move everything over to L2, it's not that the tokens on layer 1 are going to go away. So the tokens to layer 1 are actually escrowed as a part of the process of migrating over to layer 2. So of course, once again, we don't expect this to happen, but in the very worst case scenario, there are processes that the community can take in order to recover their tokens from layer 2 and then migrate to a different system as is needed. So this is something that we don't expect to do, but we want to make sure that we do have paths for that. So that's what some of the things that we're doing to mitigate the risk on that end of things. Hopefully that answered the first question.
Yeah, so I would love to speak to some operational challenges as well. I think the first and foremost, really the only one that I'd like to highlight here is Orchestrator and community uptake and an understanding of the upgrade. Because as Yann's pointed out, this is kind of an all or nothing situation. All work is being moved to L2, all rewards, all fees, etc. And I think it's paramount that the Orchestrator community adopt this upgrade as soon as possible. And I think that's predicated on the educational efforts that are ongoing and making sure that any questions, whether they're conceptual or more practical, are answered sooner rather than later. I think that's absolutely paramount. I think that participation in the testnet will be an important part of this process, as will ongoing educational resources, water cooler talks, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's something that's very much on our minds, is ensuring that the community has a good understanding of this upgrade and is prepared to play a role in it.
Cool. And then I know that there was a follow-up. There's a second question from Chris as well. So will LPT still be able to be moved back to L1? And then the follow-up to that was, and also onto other L2s. So answering the first one, yes, LPT will still be able to be moved back to L2 if people choose to do so. The caveat to this, and as is the case with, so Arbitrum is an optimistic roll-up layer 2 solution. So what I'm about to say is going to apply to all of these solutions, which is LPT will be able to move, you'll be able to move LPT back to L1, but by default, there is going to be a delay. So if you want to move LPT back to L1, you'll likely need to wait something like 7 to 8 days in order to get your LPT back on L1. If you stay on L2, no problem, you don't have to deal with that. But if you move back to L1, by default, you'll have to deal with that. That being said, within the Ethereum ecosystem, there's a number of complementary solutions to work around this. I don't think we'll have enough time to go through all of them in depth on how they work, but there are specific projects that have built easier ways to move tokens between layer 2 and layer 1. So examples of these projects include Hop Protocol, Connext, and generally there's a variety of projects that have worked on solutions that allow you to circumvent that delay, so that if you want to move your tokens from L2 back to L1, that you can do so quickly and without much of a delay. So in summary, by default, what you'll absolutely be able to do is move it back to L1 with a delay. And if you are interested in circumventing that delay, there's a variety of solutions that we'll probably try to compile resources for so people can check them out on their own. So those will be options as well. Regarding the second question, moving tokens to other L2s. So this won't be the case immediately. And this is something that other solutions in the space also come into play as well. So some of the solutions that I mentioned, like Hop Protocol or Connext, those are all projects that are working generally on making it as easy as possible to move your tokens from one chain to another, from layer 1 to layer 2, or from layer 2 to layer 2. And so in theory, any of those solutions should be able to support also moving LPT from, say, Arbitrum to another chain. So I don't think that this will be supported immediately, but there's nothing stopping that from being supported. I can't speak to the timeline for that being like easy and accessible, but what I can say is that there's nothing stopping that from existing. And I think there's plenty of existing tools that can be used to facilitate that post-confluence.
We had one other new question in the chat. This is a huge change for the protocol. Are any folks who aren't orchestrators, live peer employees also validating this snapshot? If live peer moves to another L2 solution in the future, will L1 come into play at any point, or will that migration be just arbitrum to the new L2?
Yeah, regarding the first question, that is, so I think this is where community awareness and education is important. So we definitely want as many people to have the opportunity to validate this snapshot as possible. So that includes orchestrators, that includes interested delegators, that includes any stakeholder or participant in the system. And that's why we want to make sure that there's a public review process so that it's made transparent, anyone can do so. And so to answer this question more specifically, I don't think we can speak to who exactly is definitely going to be doing that, but what our plans are to make this as accessible as possible and communicate to people that this is easy and that they should do it in order to make sure that they feel confident in this snapshot when it's used for claiming on L2. So that's for the first question. The second question, if live peer wants to move to a layer 2 solution in the future, will layer 1 come into play at any point? So ideally, any migration to another layer 2 in the future will just be layer 2 to layer 2. So at this point, just due to like, you of course need to think about technical architecture and what makes sense. I don't think we can rule out the possibility that layer 1 comes into play in technical designs going forward. However, the intent and goal is to do layer 2 to layer 2 with minimal interaction with layer 1, if any. And I think there's a good chance that we should be able to do that. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that layer 1 is involved in some shape or form, but I think there's a good chance that we can just do layer 2 to layer 2. And that's one of the benefits of kind of proactively going to a layer 2 already, where it's just going to be easier if you're already on a layer 2 to then migrate to another layer 2 from a cost point of view. So in summary, the high probability that we can just go to another layer 2. There is the possibility that layer 1 comes into play, but the goal will be to minimize interaction with layer 1 as much as possible.
Does anyone else have any questions or feedback for Yandin and Hunter before we move on to the update on fast verification? Cool. Just to close this out, really appreciate the community's engagement in Confluence, everyone who's been commenting on the forum, showing up on this call. The core team takes super seriously everyone's feedback. And as you can tell from Hunter and Yandin, really want to be responsive to that. And that requires your input in the first place. So thank you to everyone. Cool. Fast verification. Yandin, what's new?
Cool. So this will be relative to the previous update shorter. And what I just wanted to cover here is to give people a sense of where we're at in the process of that rollout. And first and foremost, if people are not familiar with what fast verification is, it was an improvement to the transcoding verification system used by the Live Peer network that we shared R&D forum post on a few months ago. And since then, we've implemented the majority of the changes required in the Go Live Peer node in order to support this type of update to the transcoding verification system. And previously, we had done testing on the network, which involved basically each node on the network got access to a new capability, which is called a video signature capability. And that video signature capability allows a node to actually generate specific data that's required for fast verification from a broadcaster's point of view. And previously in our testing, we encountered a few bugs and issues with that implementation, which was related to the different environments that a node could be running in. For example, Windows versus Linux, or different GPU models. And the team ended up working a lot on debugging these issues and addressing them. And since then, we've actually made really good progress on addressing those issues. And also shout out to all the orchestrators that participated in the recent testing process, where we put out a more up-to-date version of the transcoding benchmarking tool, which allowed orchestrators to actually test for themselves if this video signature capability introduced any issues on their GPUs. So that was fairly successful. Thank you to Papa Bear / Solar Farm for organizing that effort in Discord. And where we're at now is that we're just working towards the next attempt at a rollout. And that starts with a new go live peer release containing all these fixes, which we expect to go out soon. Actually, if all goes well, hopefully later today. We expect that go live peer release to go out. People will have time to upgrade, and then we'll be looking at another attempt at rolling this system out in practice sometime in the next few weeks. And as people can tell, this has been a little bit of a more drawn out process than originally intended. And part of this came from a little bit of resource contention in that due to the focus on Confluence, we ended up prioritizing a lot of the design work on Confluence first and foremost, with some of the fast verification stuff happening a little bit more in the background, but it's very much still ongoing. It's still something that is important and we're planning on pushing through. It just happened to be the case that we prioritize Confluence a little more so that we can make faster progress there. So that's my quick update there, just in summary in terms of what to expect. Expect to see a new go live peer release with various fixes relative to relevant for fast verification soon, and then having some time to upgrade to that new node version. And then from there on out, expect to see more fast verification tests happening on the network, and we'll be in communication about that just so that people are aware that it is going to be happening. So that's it for fast verification for now.
Great. Any questions or comments from folks on that? Cool. I'm just going to quickly post links to the fast verification background and the community-driven testing by Papa Bear in the chat. Great. Well, we have finished a little bit early, unless anyone else has anything they want to add. It's been a great call. Awesome. Looks like everyone's questions have been answered for now. So stay tuned, and we'll be following up soon. And thanks everyone for joining. Cheers.